Hi, AJ Hartley here, novelist, Shakespeare professor. Obviously, somebody invested in publishing, and this is part of an ongoing series in which I talk to prominent, successful writers about their mode of publishing, how they got to it, things that they learned along the way. And today's guest is Leah Cypess. And she has lots of great things to say, particularly about writing for younger readers, which we haven't really talked about on this channel. So I hope you find it entertaining and instructive. Enjoy. Leah Cypess is the author of the middle grade series Sisters Ever After, the upcoming early chapter book series Miriam's Magical Creatures File, and the upcoming middle grade book, which has the best title ever, Future Me Saves the World and Ruins My Life. She has also published 4 young adult fantasy novels and numerous works of short fiction. She's a 3-time Nebula Award finalist and a World Fantasy Award finalist. These are huge deals. She lives in Silver Springs, Maryland with her family, and you can learn more about her and her books at leahcypess.com. Cypess, not Cyprus, as we have already discussed. And I will add those links to the description of this video so you'll be able to find her easily. It's so great to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me.
So let's start at the beginning, which is to say your beginning. How did you get started as a writer? What did you write first, and what was your initial path to publication?
All right, so my path into writing was really through science fiction and fantasy. I've always been a science fiction and fantasy fan. As a kid, I even subscribed to science fiction and fantasy magazines, some of which still exist, some of which no longer exist. And I started submitting short stories when I was in high school. I actually got my first, and I obviously didn't know what I was doing. I got my first story professionally published more or less by accident in 11th grade. And then I was like, all right, time to move on to books. And I started sending out books, which thankfully nobody published because they were not really good enough. But I always, even though this interview is going to be mostly about me working in the children's space, ironically, I always thought of myself as a writer of adult fantasy novels. That is what I thought I was writing. So my first published book, which is called Mistwood, which is now out of print, but it was published by HarperCollins a while ago, I wrote it thinking that it was an adult fantasy novel. And I didn't understand why nobody was interested in it. And then I spoke to a friend of mine, Michael Burstein, and he said to me, "How long is it?" And I said, "It's 70,000 words." And he said to me, "Well, that is not long enough for an adult fantasy book. It's got to be 100,000 words. Can you add 30,000 words?" And I was like, "I do not think I can add 30,000 words." And that was around the time when young adult was really getting started. And really, when I was a kid, young adult was all, like girls dying of cancer. That was the entire young adult
Mhm.
section. And those were good books, but it was not what I wanted to write. But around this time, young adult was really becoming a genre in its own, especially at that time it was paranormal romance more than fantasy, but there was some fantasy, and I started reading it. And I was like, well, my book is, it's high fantasy, it's set in a medieval world. There's no high school, so I can easily just age down my characters a few years and see if this is
Okay.
an adult book.
So first question, when are we talking exactly? What year?
So my first book was published in 2010. So the time when I was coming to all these realizations was probably about 2008. So a long,
And
long time
okay.
ago.
Right. And when you say aged, so for people who are less familiar with this, obviously one of the defining features of a young adult novel, is the age of the protagonist. So how old were your characters when you started out, and what did they become?
Right. So at the time, young adult, like 18 was the hard limit for, I don't actually even know if that's true anymore because I've moved away from young adult, but at the time, your main character could not be older than 18. My main characters were 21. But again, this was a medieval style world, so they could easily be 18 and have the same um, kind of have the same story being told about them. But what I discovered once I sold the book to a young adult publisher is that I could not actually tell the story in the same way. So it was sort of a coming of age story to begin with, because there are a lot of fantasy, a lot of adult fantasy is coming of age stories. But instead of adding 30,000 words, I had to cut about 10,000. I had a lot of pages where my characters just thought and plotted, and discussed, and dealt with her feelings, and nothing really happened. And, my editor was always, these 3 pages of rumination you have, can we maybe make that 2 paragraphs?
Right, right, right. So how did you, so we're already talking to editors. How did that happen?
Yeah, um, so I had been submitting books for a long time. My first published book was actually my fifth manuscript that I had completed and sent out to publishers. And many
Hmm.
of the earlier ones that I'd sent out, which again, I started in high school, were young adult because I was just writing for the age that I was. So by then, even though by 2008, you really couldn't send to most publishers without agents, I sort of had an in with a lot of publishers because a lot of editors had written to me back and said, we cannot publish this book, but we would like to see your next book.
Uh-huh.
So by the time I was sending out this fifth manuscript that I'd written, I had a list of about 12 to 15 publishers where I could just send it. I didn't have to through an agent. There was an editor there who would read the next thing I sent. And
That's kind of amazing. I mean, do you think that would still happen?
so it's hard to say if it would still happen. Again, it's because I had started 10 years before that.
Right.
So in other words, 2008 is already distant history, but if we're talking like 1998, a lot of children's publishers and young adult publishers and even adult publishers allowed authors to send them books directly. Now I have an agent, so I don't think about it that much.
Yeah.
But I have a second agent. I'm on my second agent now, which we can talk about also. My impression is that these days you really need an agent to get a publisher to look at your manuscript.
And when you're talking about publishers, we're talking about Big
So
Five. We're talking about.
yeah. So my first book so it was published by HarperCollins.
Mhm.
At that time, there was a big six. It was a big
Right.
six. And there were also a lot more independent publishers who were, kind of mid-sized publishers. So when I started sending out books on my own, I had a list of about 25 publishers to send to. And again, I really didn't know the difference between who I was sending to. I didn't really understand that some of these publishers were part of the big six and some were smaller independent publishers. I was essentially flying blind.
Mm.
Nowadays, I think that most people go in knowing more because the internet exists and there's a lot of information. On the other hand, there's also a lot of false information.
True.
So sometimes I feel like people know more, but more of it is wrong. I don't know if it's an advantage or not. But again, I started out really not knowing what I was doing. I had very few writer friends. I was in a critique group, but it was all other unpublished writers who didn't necessarily know more than I did. And do you remember the children's writers and illustrators market?
Mm. Yeah.
I went to the library, I looked at that book, sent out things to publishers. I had no connections and very little knowledge.
And you were working in an area which in the late 90s was about as hot as it could get. YA was massive from Harry Potter into Twilight, right? And it
Right.
was
So
the
YA was
salvation of the
just
publishing industry.
Yes, YA was just getting started then, which worked to my advantage. Although high fantasy in YA was very much not what people were looking for back then.
Right.
So I think once I got a book published and I, joined a debut group and I sort of got much more knowledgeable and, much more connected to the writing world. But in my debut group, there was me and one other person who were publishing a high fantasy.
Mm, mm. So you land your first publisher was HarperCollins,
Yeah, so my first publisher was HarperCollins. I did four
starting at the
young adult
top,
books with them. Yeah,
right?
it was nice. It was actually it was Green Willow Books, and they are the publisher of my one of my absolute favorite authors as a kid, who is Diana Wynne Jones. So the fact
Mhm.
that my publisher was Diana Wynne Jones' publisher was, when I got the call, I was just jumping all over the apartment.
And at some point, did you get an agent to manage your contracts with HarperCollins, or did you stay unagented throughout your experience with them?
So my editor actually said to me on the call, she said, you should get an agent to negotiate the contract with us.
Ah, interesting.
Yeah.
That's
Um,
really interesting. I mean, I wonder how her handlers felt about giving
no,
you
I
kind of
think they
advice.
wanted that. I think that,
Really?
in other words, they weren't trying to take advantage of me.
Mm, interesting.
Obviously their business, they weren't gonna be like, here's a huge advance just for the heck of it.
Mm,
But I think that publishers really prefer to deal with agents because, especially coming from like a new author who I think she could tell knew nothing about the business, right? They wanted to work with someone who understands how things works. Again, they were willing, to negotiate, to know the terms, to know what could be expected, what could not be expected. I think editors like often giving news through agents because that way the agent can hear the author cry and not the editor.
Yep.
But they wanted it to be a professional relationship. And I was
Interesting.
I was a newbie at that point, very much not a professional.
And did they recommend agents or did you do that by yourself?
So she said to me, you can look for an agent on your own. We know an agent who actually just sold us a young adult fantasy novel. He might be a good person to talk to. So I talked to that agent. I ended up signing with that agent. At the time, as a newbie author, that seemed like a great way to get an agent. I couldn't believe my luck.
Mm,
Later on, it became clear to me that even though it's the harder route to go through the slush pile and get an agent who's willing to take a risk on you, then you end up with an agent who's willing to take a risk on you, as opposed to
mm,
an agent who's just, doing the professional thing. Obviously, he liked my stories enough. He wouldn't have taken them if he hated them, but, he wouldn't have pulled me from a slush pile.
mm.
He didn't love me that much. He wasn't gonna, really push for me the way an agent who loves your writing is.
Oh, interesting. So, and you said you're on your second agent now.
Right.
So at some point you decided to part ways with this agent.
Yeah, so I had four books published with HarperCollins, and then they did not want to take my next book. So my agent went out on submission with it, and during that process, again, I have nothing against my agent. He was perfectly professional. He did his job.
What
But I
kind
think
of agency was he at?
well, I'm sorry?
What kind of agency was he at? You don't have to be
Oh, just
specific, but,
a standard
but I
literary
mean,
agency.
big agency, boutique agency.
Um, So the truth is, at the time, I wasn't even knowledgeable enough to know. I knew that he was with an agency. I met with him personally. He was but I know his agency had a foreign rights department. Like it was a regular agency. It wasn't one of the huge ones that everyone has heard of. And yeah, so it just became clear to me also because by now I knew other writers. So I knew that, this agent, he was willing to submit my books, he was willing to go negotiate my contracts, and that was all I thought an agent should be doing. But I knew from other writers who had agents who were just much more into them that there are other things an agent can do for you also. They can advise you on which project to pursue next. They can intervene with the publisher when you have disputes. And that was not this guy's thing. So I decided um, after about a year of agonizing over it, because it also meant abandoning this manuscript that he was submitting, I decided to part ways with him and look for a new agent.
And which came first, the looking for a new agent or the parting ways with the old one?
Oh, no, you have to part ways with your old agent first.
Okay.
So, in other words, we had a call where, we broke up and, I was the one who said it, but he was very happy and definitely did not argue with me.
Uh,
And then I wrote a new manuscript and, sent it out to agents. And by this time, I had a better idea of what I was doing. So I had friends who had agents. I knew who liked their agent, who didn't like their agent. I had a pretty short list of about 10 agents. Because, as I'm sure you know, a bad agent is worse than no agent.
mhm.
So I sent this manuscript out to 10 agents. None of them wanted it. I wrote another manuscript. And again, all of them were like, we love your writing. We love your published books. We don't think we can sell this book. Wrote another manuscript, sent it
And
out.
with these new books, were they similar to what you had done before, or were you going in a different direction?
So they were a little bit different, but they were all teen novels. And what I didn't realize at the time, but what I know now, is that it was going to be very hard for me to publish another teen novel because I was no longer an exciting debut author. I was
Mm,
an author with an established sale records with my teen novels, which was obviously I was not a best-selling teen author. And at
right.
that time, YA was doing amazing,
Yeah.
best-selling trilogies were coming out right and left. So,
Yeah. I think
um,
that I think you bring up a really good point. I just want let's clarify it because I think that a lot of people when they're struggling to get their first book published think all I have to do is get my foot in the door. And after that first book comes out, it's all gravy. Everything it gets easier from that point on. And as you suggest, that simply is often not the case, right? That the moment you get published, you have a track record. And the
right.
very first thing when you submit your next book, the first thing that every publisher does is look at your sales numbers from the last book. And if they are not what they would like, and they never are, let's be honest, right? They always want the next massive selling book.
Right.
And if you don't have a massive track record, that counts against you. And it can actually get harder to get published the longer you go on, right?
Yes, correct. So I also, when I got that first phone call from HarperCollins, I thought this is it. I'll never be on submission again.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, so being in it later, in a way, it's harder to get your book in the door. I will say what makes it easier is the knowledge that you gain. So by this time, I was no longer a newbie who didn't understand how the industry worked, who didn't know who the agents were. Yeah, I had really like the connections that you make from getting, or the connections that I made from getting published were in a sense the most valuable thing that I got.
Mhm.
So again, so I wrote, so long story short, I wrote 4 manuscripts before I wrote something that, an agent thought that she could sell.
I, again, yeah, I mean, this just underscores the previous point. I mean, I don't think people always realize how hard it is, not just to get published initially, but how to keep going. And the fact that you had to produce 4 other books before your next one got through the door is, a testament to your persistence and your work ethic. What happened to those other books? Are they still in the pipeline somewhere? Did they come out, or are they on a file on your computer?
No, so they're in a file on my computer. Actually, during the pandemic, when the libraries were closed, I printed them all out and gave them to my kids who were desperate for reading. So
Okay.
they had that value. And when I got my new agent, I actually, once we had signed and she was on submission with that book, I said to her, here are these books that I wrote and submitted. Some of them she had seen already because I had sent them all to her. But I said, do you think that I could rework any of these books or that any of these books might be saleable now? And she told me that there was one of them that she said, yeah, if you rework that a little bit, I could probably sell it. And I started, but what I discovered was that, and in theory, that's still on my list of things to work on. But
Mm.
what I discovered is that I'm just more interested in working on the new things that I'm working
Yeah,
on.
I know. I know that feeling. Yeah, from periodically, I'll go back to something that I've had sitting around for years, and think, I just tweak it here and there, and jazz it up, and make it a bit more it's amazing how quickly you lose faith in that, and lose interest, as you say, and want to
Right.
do something different. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So you got the second agent.
Right. So I got the second agent with this manuscript that actually got me an offer from more than one agent because I'd finally written something that was good for the market that a bunch of people thought they could sell, but then it didn't sell.
Yeah,
That
I had it.
manuscript that got me the agent didn't sell.
Yeah.
Um, and and that was when, from suggestions from various people, so those were all, I had been writing all young adult manuscripts this whole time. I decided to try to write a middle grade based on a suggestion actually from my original editor at HarperCollins. And that book that I wrote was Thornwood, which was the first in the Sisters After series. And that was what I guess you could call my second break, because an editor wanted that. And actually, you know, it turned into a 6 book deal. So it was,
Wow.
which is amazing to have a 6 book
Yeah.
deal. I probably will never have that again in my publishing career. So,
So let's talk about that move because I mean, you mentioned your kids. I don't want to get overly invasive biographically, but you have kids,
yes,
and because I think sometimes one of the challenges, especially writing either YA or particularly middle grade, is that people imagine what they think kids want, and they don't always know, and what they remember from their own childhood is very different from what kids are looking for today. So how did you come to make that switch? And what what did you find most challenging about moving from a YA voice
right.
and plot kind of structure to what you're doing for middle grade?
Right. So actually, so part of what made me make that move was that my children were reading middle grade books at the time.
Yeah.
So I was becoming very familiar with the genre. With that said, the voice was extremely challenging because when I write young adult, I'm really writing for myself. Like I said, my first young adult book, I actually thought was an adult book. And all of us have this internal age that we think we are. And in my mind, I think I'm still like 17. So young adult was very easy for me. I was essentially writing a book that I thought I would like.
Mm.
And when I wrote middle grade, I was really writing a book that I thought my children would like. So it was a very, very different process for me in terms of the balance between writing for yourself and writing for an audience. in young adult, I didn't really have to strike that balance because it was the same thing. And in middle grade, I did.
Um, can you, this is a very difficult question, so I apologize, but can you nail down what the difference is for you at least in terms of the voice particularly? What is it? How do the sentences work? What is it that feels different? When you pick up a middle grade book and you start to read it and you immediately know it's a middle grade book, what is it?
Right. So the answer is that it's the voice, as you said. And the question is one that I can't really answer. I struggled with it a lot. The first time I tried to write a middle grade book, I actually failed in this completely. Every feedback that I got was, you say this person is 12, but she sounds like she's 15.
Mm,
That was the consistent feedback that I got. So I can't give you a rule book as for how I did it. I'll say there were two tricks that helped me a lot. One is that while I was working on Thornwood, I completely stopped reading young adult
mm,
because I found that it was just too easy for me to get the voices confused.
mm,
I read middle grade, or I also read adult books because that to me was not confusing. But I basically read a lot of middle grade and I cut myself off from young adult completely.
mm,
And the second thing is that instead of writing a 12-year-old character, I made all my main characters 11 because for some reason in my mind, if I was writing a 12-year-old, I was always, aging her up. And again, this is all instinctual. I can't really, I mean, for me, voice is something that has to happen. It's not something that I can, sit down and figure out how to do. But I found that if I made her 11, it was just much easier for me to keep in mind, this is an 11-year-old, don't try to write them like they're a young teenager.
And for you, what is the spread for middle grade in terms of protagonist age?
So, I mean, so the standard spread that people give is 8 years to 12 years. I'll say so the middle grade book, Future Me Saves the World, which, by the way, thank you for saying that you love the title because there were so many emails about that title. It went
What
through so many
what did
changes.
you come up with the title or was it foisted?
It was me and my editor together. I can't even remember anymore because like one of us came up with Future Me and the other one came up with Saves the World and that it was really collaborative.
Hmm,
But in that book, the main character, that's a younger middle grade, and the main character is 10. And again, I
hmm,
wrote that a little differently, writing from the perspective of a 10-year-old, as in younger middle grade versus writing from the perspective of an 11-year-old for upper middle grade. My editor for the Sisters Ever After series was always calling it a tween series,
hmm.
which is a category that doesn't actually exist. But
D- do you think that the age of the protagonist equates directly to the age of the readership?
I don't. I think that kids often read up or read down. But I do think that I think, in other words, I think that children are willing to read about all different ages, but children really change a lot, much more rapidly than adults or even teenagers.
Hmm,
So a 10-year-old voice and a 12-year-old voice are really going to be very different, even though an 8-year-old might be reading both of those books.
hmm, hmm. And people often say today that within I was going to say within reason, but maybe that's not even true. That anything you can do in an adult book, you can do in a YA book or of a certain kind, but that's absolutely not the case for middle grade. Do you have, when you're writing middle grade, are you being attentive? What are the things that you're not going to do? You're not going to touch.
Right. So I mean, so the main thing, so I think you can touch everything a little bit, but the main thing for me is that adults, definitely adults and also teenagers are willing to read depressing books.
Mm,
And in my experience, children are not unless they are forced to in school. Again, not all children,
mm,
but for the most part, children want to read books that are fun to read. And that make them feel good. If you give a kid a book and the ending is too depressing or too sad, for the most part, they're really not going to be, they're not going to come away, with that book thinking I should recommend this to all my friends. Now, that
mm,
doesn't mean there can't be anything sad or depressing in the book, but it means the book as a whole, the purpose of the book. Sometimes you read adult books and you feel like the purpose of this book was to tell you that all people are awful. The world is a terrible place. And
yeah.
so so for me, and again, I'm sure the second I finish, I'll be like, oh, except for that middle grade book that does that. But as a whole, I think that you cannot write a middle grade book with that purpose.
Mm, mm. Yeah. In terms of, so the publisher for your new series is,
So the Sisters Ever After series is Random House. Future Me Saves the World is Simon and Schuster, and then to get to my youngest book, the early chapter book series, that's being published by Amulet Books.
okay. So, um, one of the questions that I often get through these videos is about self-publishing. And I'd like to address how important traditional publishers are specifically for middle grade and younger. Um, how do people find your books and who's
Right.
buying them?
So I was talking actually with Diana, who you interviewed. I remember a while ago when I didn't have any agent and I couldn't get an agent. And I just written my third manuscript that wouldn't get me an agent. We were talking about self-publishing, and I remember she said to me, "Well, and I did not want to do self-publishing." And she said to me, "Well, what is your goal for your books?" And I said, "I want my books to be in public libraries." Like that is really to me that's most important. I grew up, going to the library. I love libraries. And that's real. I think that's where most kids find books is in libraries. And, as a self-published author, really libraries, I'm sure there are people who can get into them, but that's not really going to be your market.
No.
So I think that, and again, even though kids read books on Kindle a lot these days, so I can even see the difference in my own children, like the oldest will not read a book on a screen, completely uninteresting. My youngest, who is now 9 years old, to her it's the same thing. Paper, screen, as long as it's a book, she doesn't care.
Mm-mm.
So I wonder if that will mean that self-publishing becomes more viable even for children's writers. But right now, I think most kids find their books, by walking around and looking at them in bookstores or libraries, by kids handing books to other kids. I don't
Schools
think,
and yeah,
yeah.
yeah. And there's a market issue, right, as well, because most middle grade kids are not purchasing the books themselves, right?
Well, so right. So they're usually not buying books themselves, but I will see very often, let's say if you go into a bookstore, like often go into a bookstore with my kids and I'll be like, all of you look around, choose one book. I'll buy each of you one book. So they don't have the money, but that doesn't mean they're not the ones making the choices about what
Okay.
books they want to read.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I was just thinking to differentiate in terms of that and a true YA demographic who has disposable income and they can browse on Amazon or whatever and
Right.
purchase whatever they feel
Right,
like.
right. So so I don't really, I won't say most, but it's my impression that most, certainly 8 to 10 year olds, probably also 8 to 12 year olds are not just, are not permitted to just go online, go on Amazon and buy whatever they want, you know,
Mm-mm. Yeah.
online.
Yeah. Um, do you think when you're writing for younger readers, are you also writing for, I don't know, parents, teachers, librarians, those threshold guardians who may mediate the book in certain respects with certain readers?
Right. So I am really not. So to talk for a minute about my early chapter book, which we didn't get to, Miriam's Magical Creature Files.
Mm.
I wrote that on playgrounds and read it to my kids on playgrounds. And when I was finished, I sent it to my agent and I basically said, "Do you think you could sell this?" And I had no idea if her answer would be yes or no, because I like to think about my direct audience. And luckily, I have a really great agent who can give me the heads up if this will not pass muster with the people who actually need to publish and buy the books.
And the reading age for those books is what?
So that's 5 to 7.
5 to 7, and
Yeah.
they're illustrated?
Yes, they are illustrated.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about that because often people say, I'm going to do this and I've done the paintings, or my neighbor or my cousin or whatever. How do you work with an illustrator? Where does that illustrator come from?
Right. So I can't really speak about picture books
Right.
because I haven't done those yet. But for these books, I know it's illustrated, but it's mostly text. It's for children who are just starting to learn how to read. So the point is they're supposed to be reading it. It's not like a picture book that's meant to be read to them while they look at the
Okay.
pictures.
Okay.
But it is heavily illustrated. And I'm the illustrator of these books is Sarah Lynn Roll. And so I submitted just the text of the book with, one or two illustration notes, but really for the most part, I left illustration decisions to the illustrator. And once it got picked up by the publisher actually chose the illustrator. But in
Right.
each case, before reaching out to an illustrator, my editor would send me an email and say, this is who we're gonna, I think this would be a great illustrator for the book. What do you think?
Mm.
And what I could think was either yes, or if I really, really didn't like that illustrator style, I could have said so. But for the most part, she was just checking in with me to make sure I didn't really hate it. It's really the publisher's job to choose the illustrator.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think sometimes people can sort of unwittingly, cause red flags to go up by being uh, unprofessional in
Right.
their assumptions about these things. But yeah, I think you're right. I think every person who's done any book that is either heavily or at least or partially illustrated that I've spoken to seems to have a version of your experience
Right.
where
I
the
mean, yeah.
publisher's making a decision. Yeah.
Yeah, there are people who write and illustrate or who do graphic novels and they do
Right.
everything. That's great, but you have to actually be, I think you have to be separately able to sell your work in both. So, for example, the illustrator of these books, Sarah Lynn Rule, she also has picture books where she has written and illustrated them.
Right.
But you can see that she's someone, in other words, she's an illustrator in her own right, and she's a writer in her own right. She's not what I am, which is someone who's very good at writing and like passably okay at drawing. Um, Nobody would want to read a book that I illustrated.
So, where do you go from here? What's next?
So the Miriam's Magical Creature Files, book one, is coming out at the end of this month, actually, and it's under contract for 3 books. And hopefully they'll do well, and it'll be able to become a whole early chapter book series. The Simon and Schuster book is 1 book, but they asked me, they have an option for a sequel, which we're talking about. And then I have to think about what's next. And the way I do that these days is I send my agent an email, which is when I say, hey, here are the 5 ideas I have right now that I'm thinking about writing. Please tell me if any of them will not sell to anyone. And
Mm.
because, as you can see from my publishing history, knowing what's good for the market is not my strong point. I'll usually send her 5 ideas and she'll be like, oh, no, definitely not these 2. I could not sell those,
And
no matter how good they were.
will all 5 be in the same age group?
So I usually now with the experiences that I've had, I actually like working in multiple age groups at a time. And I like working with multiple publishers at a time because again, I'm not the newbie author who thought, I sold a book and that's it. This is how it's going to be from now on. So it's usually, so like I think the last email I sent her was something like, hey, here are 3 middle grade book ideas I have. Here are 2 young adult ideas I have, and here are 2 adult ideas that I have, and let me know which of these are like completely dead in the water.
Mm.
And then, of the ones that you say you could potentially sell, I'll, probably work on all of them at the same time, find out which one really, catches my muse, and then work on that one.
Do you, how can I put it? Do you enjoy each different subgenre equally, or are some harder work?
I really do. Each of them are difficult or easy in different ways. So, for example, the Miriam's Magical Creature Files books are very short.
Mm.
So, when I come off from working on that, and then I'm like, oh, I have this young adult project, I'm like, wow, it's so many words. But on the other hand,
What's the word count on the Magical Creature Project books?
it's about 7,000 words.
Wow. Mm.
Right. So as you know, I also write science fiction short stories. So in a way, I'm like, that could be a short story,
Mm.
but something has to happen in every paragraph. Like you do not get to waste any words when you're writing a book for kids of that length. Because again, kids are not going to read a book because they feel, especially that age, 5 to 7. I have worked on projects where I read them to my kids and their friends. And, if they like what I'm reading, I can tell because they're sitting there. And if they don't like what I'm reading, I can tell because they will literally just stand up when I'm in the middle of a sentence and walk away to go do something else.
That's great.
So, really, you can lose them in a sentence or two. You have to be really focused and careful. As
Yeah.
opposed to young adult, where obviously it's much longer, but you have much more room to play, and to have fun. And there's much more,
Mm.
I wouldn't say room for error, but you don't have to be as focused on like every single sentence and make sure that you don't lose the reader with it.
Is there a piece of advice that you would offer to people who were interested in writing for this age group? Something that you think helps to either keep you motivated or to raise the quality of your work and or find the audience that you think it needs?
Well, which age group, or just all of them?
Well, I mean, I'm tending to sort of think more about middle grade and earlier, just
Right.
because that's not something that we've covered in this series at all. So let's address those.
Right. So the main piece of advice I would say is to read a lot in the age group that you're writing in, which can actually be a bit of, a bit of a task because, I read young adult for fun. I read adult books for fun. So I kind of don't have to do that extra prep before I start writing one. But like I said, when I started writing middle grade, I realized I just went to the library, went to the middle grade section, got a stack of books that looked interesting and started reading them, which is not something I necessarily would have done if I hadn't been trying to write middle grade. And certainly with early chapter books, I actually had not even thought of writing an early chapter book until I started reading them to my daughter. And once I had read a bunch and I had a little bit of a sense, while I was working on these books, I just kept taking out, early chapter books and I just kept reading them because it can be really hard to keep your focus on the age that you're writing for if you're not reading it at the same time.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, that's good advice. Anything else that you would like to add? I've already kept you way longer than I said I was going to. I always,
The time has been flying. This has been a fun
yeah,
conversation. No, nothing in particular. Like I said, I actually have three books coming out this year, which is pretty amazing for me, considering that, a number of years ago I had no agent, no publisher, and no prospect of getting one. So the first one, which is coming out at the end of this month, is Miriam's Magical Creature Files: The Truth About the Tooth Fairy, which is the first in that series. Then I have the last in the Sisters Ever After series, Sea Swept, coming out in April. And in June, I have Future Me Saves the World and Ruins My Life.
excellent. And I will put the link to your website in the description for this video so people can find you easily. So, Leah, thank you so much. This has been a great, entertaining, and informative conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you. I really appreciate you having me.
Awesome. Thanks. So, as I said, I've included a link to Leia's website in the description for this video so you can find her stuff. She may well jump in on comments. So, as ever, please like, comment, subscribe. Check out my books as well. And check out my Patreon page. As I always say, this channel is not monetized, so I'm particularly grateful to my patrons who make it possible. Check out my little dashery store for shirts and mugs and things like that. And that's it. I will talk to you soon. Thanks very much. Bye.